I was asked about model airplanes and when I got started. Uh, it was back about 1958 when my brother and I started with the hobby, building kits out of balsa wood that we got from the hobby stores. In the beginning, all the kits that we built were made out of balsa wood. They had to be light, and the motors that we wanted to use just weren't powerful enough. In fact, I think we remember using elastic bands in propellers, and we'd get maybe a few feet of flight, and that was about it. When we went into motors, they weren't very strong, so we had to have very light aircraft. And most of the balsa was struts, and we had to cover them with like a plastic covering to make them as light as possible. I remember the first engines we used were made by Cox. It was an 049 and a tiny little piston on it, and but it would only drive an airplane that was maybe 8 or 10 inches long. Then later on in the hobby, we got into bigger airplanes, and they did them in cc's. And one of them I had was 40 cc's, which was quite a big engine. And it was many years before we used those. Now, it's interesting to note that the first airplanes were gasoline. And we used, I guess it was an alcohol-based gasoline. And they were smelly, they were messy. And nowadays they use electric engines and batteries, and it's very slick compared to what we were doing. And then when we actually flew them with gasoline, if we ever did a loop or inadvertently turn over a little bit, then the engine would stop and then the plane would crash because it was gravity fed on the gasoline into the engine. It was quite awkward. It took us a long time to be able to keep these things in the air. Between my brother and I, we had a lot of crashes. As a matter of fact, I did well by only crashing completely the airplanes 9 times. Donnie was a little worse. He crashed his 11 times. Now, these things run about $100 a piece. So it was a big learning curve and an expensive learning curve. I remember when covering the airplanes, we used to use shrink wrap, and it was a plastic material that we would cover the wings and the body. Well, sometimes not the body, but the wings anyway. And we used a blower, like a hairdresser blower, and it would just go and shrink the plastic over the frame of the wings. That made them perfect. In order to fly these airplanes, we used to do it with remote control. And we were using the, we were using the Citizens band, or most people were using the Citizens band, which was 27 megacycles, which doesn't exist today. Because I was a ham, we used ham radio frequencies, which were 50 megacycles. And that even had a shorter range, but at least on the ham bands, the frequencies were discrete and wouldn't interfere with any other airplanes. Any of these RF remote controllers that we're using didn't have very much range at all compared to what they have today. The radio frequency we were using were equivalent to Bluetooth and had a very short range. It wasn't that easy to find a flying field, although near us in Scarborough, IBM had a model airplane club, and they had a flying field attached to their company. We sometimes went there, but on most occasions we just went to a vacant field somewhere, usually where there was a building project going on before a subdivision was being built, and that's what we used to fly, so there wasn't any obstacles or trees. Quite often when we went out to find a field to fly in, we found another group of modelers who were looking for the same thing as we were. And before we know it, we had a bit of a club going and a place to meet on the weekends when we were doing some flying. It was quite convenient. One of the things we had to do, we had to have insurance because nobody wants anything coming out of the sky and hitting them on the head. So there was an association formed called the AMA, and they had insurance. We had to pay a little bit into it so that we were covered for flying in case we, it dropped out of the sky and hit somebody. A lot of what we learned we found from magazines. There was a couple of airplane magazine publications that had a lot of tips and tricks and one thing and another, and we picked up a lot of information there. Mind you, we were still in the hobby for about 16 years before we really could fly. I guess our last flights were at about 1974, and this is when we were flying with the bigger motors, still gasoline, but we actually were able to keep them in the air for a while, and it was quite exhilarating. When I started flying with the larger motors, one of the first planes I had was when I put a head of Snoopy in it and made it kind of cute to fly. And that was a lot of fun. But that was in the wing structure, they have a thing called dihedral, and that's where the wings are sloping upwards. A pattern ship, which was mentioned, is different. It doesn't have the sloping wings. It has wings that are straight out, and that allows the plane to fly upside down and faster and more maneuverable. The other planes are meant to fly safely and stay in the air, where it's a risky thing to fly these pattern airplanes because of the straight wing, no dihedral. This is a picture of my first pattern airplane. It was made in 1974, and it flew beautifully. One of my intermediate airplanes, and it was the first one that had straight wings that you could maneuver, was called the Ugly Stick. It was the first plane I ever built that had straight wings, and I was able to learn a little bit more about flying and maneuvering the aircraft. One of the significant parts of the hobby was all the accessories that you had to buy, the tools and the batteries and the battery chargers. As the hobby matured, I had an article published in the RC Modeling magazine, May 1976. It was a 4-page article about my big little box that held my airplane and my controller. Great memories, and one of the nice things about it, I was able to get a lot of this stuff on videotape, or actually film back at that time, and it was later transferred over to videotape. So we have all the flights, and it's just wonderful to be able to go back and watch some of this stuff.